Grand Rising Soul family. Adam Jackson here with another episode of the Sacred Sons podcast. However, this is not going to be any stale, typical episode where we talk about masculinity, because today we are bringing through Sophie Strand. And with that, we're going to get outside of the box. We're going to step outside of the labels. We're going to step outside of the thought concepts. We're going to go plant, animal, mineral, ethereal, mycelial, matriarchal. We're going to mix it all in today.
We'll compost together.
Let's compost together.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I remember our last time we talked a lot about the composting of the stories and the stories being in the soil. Mm-hmm. You know?
Well, I'm very happy to be back here, Adam. It's an honor. It feels like a full circle.
With that, our guest today, she is the author of The Flowering Wand and the new book, The Madonna Secret, an ecological reimagining of the gospel. Please welcome Sophie Strand.
Hello. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah. Are you joining us from the Northeast again today?
Indeed. I'm on the Mahicantach, which is the Hudson River, so right on the river. And I can always see like eagles and seagulls and ospreys outside my window. It's really beautiful. What about you? Where are you located today, Adam?
I am in Jamul, California. It's about 40 minutes east of San Diego, up in the mountains, where we have an underground estuary, some well water. We have some pine trees in the front yard, lots of birds, lots of hawks, wild turkeys, and lately it's been pretty chilly and rainy, which I'm loving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always love that seasonal punctuation where you really get a kind of winter pause, but we haven't totally had it here in the Hudson Valley. And I feel like it's thrown my organism off a little bit. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's check in with your organism and our human bodies here. I want to invite us to take a deep breath in for ourselves as we enter into this conversation, into this broadcast, scanning the body, feeling what is alive and present. And Sophie, on this beautiful day, what is most alive within you?
Thank you for that question. What's most alive for me are love stories right now. I've been thinking lately that love stories are this incredible way to risk your thinking, that people are so enjoy so much romances that you can, within the kind of scaffolding of a romance, try for more anarchic, interesting, ecologically rebellious characterological experiments, narrative turns. And yeah, I'm playing with my next project, which is a love story, and thinking about love stories, especially as we've just passed through St. Valentine's Day. So yeah, that's what is alive for me today.
That's beautiful. Adam checking in. I got a love story for you.
Okay.
Hannah and I and the boys, Johan in Holland, we took a trip down to Mexico. We came back and we brought back with us a stomach bug.
Yeah.
And so this is my check-in. I'm coming out of the underworld of what that is, and of all of the thoughts, fears, emotions, clean up, throw up, vomit, all the things that come along with that. But here's the love story. Brought Hannah and I closer together, because I just want to shout out right here. I mean, to the mothers of this world who are holding it down for their children in those moments when they need it the most. And I'm a witness to it. And I got good dad energy, and I was there, and I, in fact, stayed home and, spent even more time to hold it down during that time. But to see Hannah really bring in the nurturing essence of the great mother when the children are just like, what is happening? To see that, it's like, it makes me have more love and appreciation for our relationship to go into those depths. Because like you said, it's not always so bright and shiny, is it?
No, we have to be able to go to the muck. And I think it's so powerful when you have friends, intimate partners in your life who can go with you to the underworld. That's the real test of intimacy and relationship. I was just in the hospital this past weekend with some health intensity as well. And, I had my mother's energy and my father's energy, and both were incredibly important in different ways at stabilizing the experience. It's, I really think that illness, hardship can be seen as a curse, but it can also be a bottleneck where only the most important relationships and only your most authentic self, your most authentic relational intelligence comes through. So it sounds like you went through that to a certain extent. Stomach bugs can be clarifying. They really leave behind only the barest essentials. Yeah.
Extremely clarifying. And, 6 years ago, you were diagnosed with an incurable illness.
Yeah.
And so what has the journey of this particular filtering out or bottleneck been for your work? In that time, you've also written a plethora of papers, books, essays. I imagine the call to action is even greater.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I think that I oftentimes say that storytelling is an emergency. And the example I use is Scheherazade from the 1001 Nights of the Arabian Tales, which is the frame narrative for all those different stories. And she's the daughter of the vizier who is married to the king, who tends to marry a woman every night and then kill her the next morning. Scheherazade knows that to stay alive, she must tell stories that are compelling enough, but then not finish them quite, that the king wants to keep her alive. So it's adrenaline-fueled storytelling that creates a biodiversity of stories, that creates all of the 1001 different tales. And for me, I want to ask everybody, if you only had a year left, a week left, what story is your emergency? What story would keep you alive? Because if it keeps you alive, it'll keep someone else alive. And so I think for me, I've been sick since 2000. I've been, deathly ill, in and out of crises since 2010. But I think when I received the information that the condition was incurable and degenerative, that was a different path. That was a different level of intensity to hold and to begin to navigate. And I think I'm still really inside of it. I'm actually finishing a book right now, which is called The Body as a Doorway, Healing Beyond Hope in the Human, which is how can we claim healing when we're exiled from a standard narrative of getting better? What can we seek healing beyond our skin silhouettes and our, extended network of kin, both microbial, fungal, vegetal, spiritual, folkloric. So I think for me, it has given me a sense of urgency, which is I want to do the work that feels like I care about most. And I don't want to defer it. Yeah. I want to do it today. And I don't think that I'm a person who loves pleasure and cooking and lying in the sun and being like a snake, just like seeking sun on a hot stone. So I don't know if I would be as productive and as intense about my work if I didn't have that physical sense of urgency. Yeah.
This is a great place to start. How would you inspire someone who's out there right now who doesn't have your unique experience and perspective to fucking finish that book, or to start writing it, or to get on that horse, or whatever it is that they want to do or intend to do with their life? For me, it's a ukulele album that I imagine I'm writing when I'm 60 years old. Yes, I love
ukulele.
But I put it way out there because I have the illusion. I have this illusion of time. How would you inspire someone to just do it?
I think there are two different ways in, which is one, find what you really love, because what you really love, you'll hook into, and it won't be effort. You will find yourself coming back to it again and again. And I think a lot of us are told what to love, where to go, what to do, what projects to care about. But the projects that we really care about, even if they're nerdy, even if they don't seem like they're going to make money or be popular, those are the ones that are important.
Yes.
And so the
nerdier, the better, by the way.
Exactly. So I would say find the thing that really lights you up rather than the thing that feels like you should do it, like it's a good idea. Find your bad idea.
And so here I want to ask you, what is it that you love about the story of Mary Magdalene, of the Madonna? What is it that is so important for you to convey in this lifetime?
So it's so interesting. I come to that story, the story of Jesus, obliquely, like from a slant, not from a standard. My ancestors were Catholic and Christian, but I was not raised by Catholics and Christians. I was raised by an ex-Buddhist monk, by a pagan mother, by a half-Israeli Jewish family. It was—
you got the whole melting pot.
A melting pot, strange. So I had more of a strange entry point into that story. And yet I insisted, I had a lot of desire to know who these people had been, and loved the stories about them. But I also found them inherently tragic. I think I'm a kind of Shakespearean troubadour lover. Like I love love stories. Like, the troubadours are the ancient romantic, not ancient, but, the medieval romantic tradition of telling stories and, writing poetry in praise of, quote unquote, the lady. And I think that's I oftentimes call myself an animist troubadour. Like, I'm interested in love stories about microbes and fungi and stones. And I think I always saw at the heart of the gospel stories a love story that was tragic, that had been repressed. And then, of course, with the Nag Hammadi texts and the Dead Sea Scrolls, going into the history of Judaism, which is an incredibly animistic, sensual religion.
And just as an observation, aren't plants at the center of all of these stories?
Aren't,
the mushrooms, the fungi, but also the acacia bush. Also, all of the palms they lay down for Christ to walk, all of these things are so necessary for the story, yet we tend to focus on the human element when it's the non-human elements that really are the juice of the story.
Oftentimes, and only 2% of even just the population of Jerusalem during Second Temple period Palestine were literate. So, and Jerusalem is not Palestine or Judea. It's just a small, educated elite. So most of the people in that time period were illiterate. So their gospel, their scripture was the land, was oral. It was oral traditions. And you were walking through scripture, you were passing the stone that a prophecy happened on. You were reading as you were walking. Oftentimes I say that in Aboriginal culture, they have song lines, but then in Second Temple period Palestine, people were living psalm lines, that they were walking through scripture and speaking it aloud, singing it, embodying poetry. So we have to replant Jesus in a tradition that was inherently ecological, embodied, oral, relational, very attentive to seasonal changes, to lunar patterns, to farming rituals,
to celestial activity, to UFOs. There are even references, So there
are all of these, and I oftentimes say that the missing gospel is the land. And so in my retelling of I wanted to retell the story as a love story, but a love story that's about love with land. And that Jesus is a person who is in love with the land, in love with nature metaphors, in love with weeds and species and beings that other people would consider impure, that he loves leaven, he loves grain, he loves, the people and the plants that are outcasts. So I wanted to reframe it as a love story with the Magdalene. Definitely. I love a good love story. But I also wanted it to retell it as a love story with the land that has been lost when the story has been uprooted from its Aramaic, from its Judaism, from its ecological context, from its imperial pressures and context, and mistranslated through telephone over many, many hundreds of years. So can we bring the land back to life?
That's beautiful. I love this idea of walking through scripture.
Yeah.
And how that feels, and it's a reminder to me that life is the ceremony, life is the prayer, and that we're never going to find anything of greater value in the book than if we go out and live it, if we go out and feel it, if we go out and feel our feet on the earth.
Exactly. And lately I've been saying that we've lost true literacy. That it used to be that literacy was being able to read leaf patterns, being able to read the way the sun was shining for the time of day, that we used to be able to read and thus have an intimate dialogue with our environments. And we've lost that literacy in turn for this relatively anthropocentric, static literacy of just the human word. Can we bring back to life this environmentally embedded literacy?
And so that, even that concept, environmental literacy, it's so different than like the environmentalism or the environmentalist movement, because that's even more indoctrinated into Western culture. I feel like what you're speaking about is it's more poetic. It's more human.
Well, it's also deeply contextual and deeply local. And I think that there's a strain of environmentalism that's deeply paired to a kind of techno-solutionism, which is just re-articulating the same problems it's attempting to fix. And I think what's really important is to realize that every environment is going to have a specific assemblage of beings that have different concerns and ideas and stories. And so that environmentalism wants to create a homogenized universal approach, but that's not how ecosystems work. That, you can't take a tropical plant and plant it in New York and expect it to still thrive. So we're all going to need to become more ecologically situated where we are and realize that there are going to be very particular stories and scriptures available to us in specific places.
Yeah. Why have we lost that? I'm even thinking, I'm from Ohio, in this particular place where I'm from.
Ohio, yeah. I was just reading about what's happening.
Yeah. I was going to go in a totally different place, but yes, I'm from Ohio. There's currently this, environmental disaster that has happened where, I think they said 120 car train, can I remember it, filled with vinyl chloride, crashed, spilled out everywhere. There's tons of this stuff going into the earth. And then they decided to ignite it and light it on fire.
Which just sent it out into the air, meaning that it's going to disperse for a long time.
Yeah. What is this? How are we allowing this to continue to happen?
Adam, that's my question. I think that sometimes it's so hard to hold. I think it's really impossible to hold this amount of pain in a single human body. And I oftentimes think that when we have this idea in Western culture of the atomized individual, that healing happens in an individual body and pain must be held in an individual body. But with something this big, we have to join hands and disperse it. The pressure is too much for one individual to hold.
Yeah.
I think I don't have any answers for this kind of ecocidal madness. I don't understand how we can keep shooting arrows that we know turn back into our own breast. How do we do that? Yeah. It seems like complete madness. I can see the long historical arc of it. I can see how certain types of paradigms lead to this, but why have we reached this intensity of it? I'm not sure.
Yeah. And if the solutions are not necessarily technological, maybe in fact they're mythological. Maybe we have to actually fall back in love with the earth itself so that we can treat her and court her in a new way. Because yeah, preach. This is how do we court her back into let's call it like a healthy relationship?
Yeah, I love the summoning of courtship. It's just always, which means that, we've been not very kind to our ecosystems and our environment. So we can't just reach out our hands and expect them to just be like, they're cautious. They're like lovers that have been scorned. So we need to come in. We need to listen. We need to be soft. We need to offer gifts. We need to really practice courtship. So I love that word. I think, I also want to summon the words of one of my favorite people, Bioko Malafe, who says, the times are urgent, we must slow down. And I think that our desire to accelerate through the trouble to some kind of solution oftentimes creates more problems. So I think that whatever we do has to be slow, and just so much more listening. Can we learn to listen with our whole bodies, with our skin, with our tongues, with our hair? Can we learn to go outside and say, what do I need to know today? And then open up our whole bodies to receive that message.
And the question for us as humanity is, are we willing to receive and listen to that message?
I think there are many people who are, but then the people with I think the thing that's so troubling is there are a small group of people who are unwilling and they have a lot of power.
Yeah.
Here's something that I've been thinking about a lot. When a person is traumatized and scared, it's much easier to try and regain control by trying to fix something, by trying to have an approach. But oftentimes that panicked attempt to regain control, to figure something out, isn't actually the best step.
Yeah.
And I think that I see within our culture, especially within conservation and a lot of environmentalism, is because we're out of control right now, we're trying to attempt to manage landscapes, to manage our emotions, to manage our relationships to things, to figure out where everything belongs, rather than saying we are humans with comic streak short lives. And we are looking at ecosystems with million-year-long lives. How could we attempt to be able to see the whole thing and understand the whole narrative arc? And I think that we need to develop a better musculature of humility when it comes to deep time stories, to ecosystem stories. And I don't see that in a lot of political and environmental discourse right now. Not a lot of humility about what we can even see. You know, there's an amazing scientist called Jacob von Uxel, who about 100 years ago came up with this idea of umwelts. Do you know about this?
No.
The idea was that every being, by virtue of its organism and its senses, sees a different world than another being. And some things are available to it and some things are not, which means that there are many different worlds contained within one world. But that by virtue of what you can see and not see, you have blind spots. That, there could be a being next to you that can see colors and see, they're showing that bees may navigate by electromagnetic fields, that there are so many things we will never be able to see. And thus we should have humility about that. And I think that I wish that human beings in positions of power could begin to understand that we can't see everything because we are embodied, because we have a certain kind of limitation to what we can physically experience. That's not a bad thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reflection of nature itself and its diversity.
Yeah.
And the diversity of all of the senses, not just the limited 5 that we are present to at this time. Although
yeah.
I have some other theories about senses and humans that, this is way out in left field, but like pyramids, temples, ancient human building. If I look at nest making, if I look at bees making honeycombs, I wonder if there is electromagnetic mathematical frequency that Nikola Tesla was tapped into that others have been able to access, where like this art of pyramid building is actually encoded in our DNA, just like it is for a bee to build a hive and a honeycomb.
Well, I think my big thing I'm really interested in is I don't think any being thinks alone. I think the idea of a self is very plastic. Yes. And I think that when we find ways of quorum sensing, that's what bacteria do when they move and think as a colony, or swarm, we look at swarming. And then we also look at the history of ecstatic dance and ritual. There's a great book about this Barbara Ehrenreich wrote called Dancing in the Streets, which is when you get people together, all dancing together and chanting, they start to think together and sync up their movements in ways that we can't totally understand. We can't totally predict. And I find that very interesting as a kind of technology. And I think there are technologies of extended embodiment and extended cognition that are very powerful that we've forgotten. And then when I look at certain types of buildings and certain types of ritual that we have artifacts from, but not the complete picture of, I think that they were created by swarming beings, by ecstatic beings that were composed of not just one self, but many selves.
Ecstatic beings.
Yeah.
Oof. I love the thought of that. It makes sense to me because the work that we do with Sacred Sons, I'm often in groups of men who are getting to an ecstatic state, a really heightened emotional state in the high highways and in the deepest depth type of ways. And there is a sync that happens. There is something naturally that happens in a group setting when we all say yes.
Exactly.
And we even have a practice where we all chant yes together. It's simple and it's fun, but it's like even just something as simple as that can evoke a new level of sensation for our human experience.
Exactly. And I sometimes think about you know, there's this great experiment called the rubber hand experiment, where scientists, you'll put your hand under the table and then rub this rubber hand with a brush. And very quickly your brain reorganizes and it stops sending signals to your hand and starts like trying to send them to the rubber hand. Like your body will just incorporate the rubber hand, like neurologically. Right. And I think that we can do that with each other. We can be each other's rubber hands. We can start to think with each other. And when we do that, how much better could we think if we weren't just thinking with our own brains? And how much, also to go back to the sacred sons, how much deeper could we feel? How much more could we heal?
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm experiencing, and I'm present to it at every time. It's almost miraculous, but it's miraculous in the way that it's almost a cosmic joke how accessible it is to us.
That's the thing, is it's so accessible. It's not. It's there. I mean, I sometimes think that really the answer to everything is dance, and it seems so silly, but like that's it.
If you take away nothing else from this podcast, dance is the answer. Whatever question you have right now today, if you're listening this far, whatever question is on your heart, the answer is dance.
Well, and when you look at a lot of revolutionary movements, they're born out of dancing movements. You look at the Maenad swarms with Dionysus and, Pacula Anya and Spartacus and these like huge revolts against the Roman Empire. Those are dancing. And then also you see the St. Vitus dance and the dancing of the peasants after the plague and the Jacobin revolts. Dancing is always part of revolt and rebellion against paradigms of oppression.
Wow. That's brilliant. Let's go back into the Madonna Secret. I want to go back to Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
I understand that there's a love story there.
Yeah.
And I was a big fan of the Dan Brown novels. The Da Vinci Code. I'm all for it, and I'm all for the idea that maybe Mary Magdalene and Jesus were married, and that their bloodline was what filled this sacred chalice, let's say. What do you think?
So I have two ways in. So one, I use fiction as a way of testing ideas so that I'm not saying that I'm right.
Yeah.
And I think that when you have when there's been so much time passed, there's been so many massacres of people who had certain belief systems, and the erasure of the many, Christianity in the first century was a biodiversity of practices, and most of them get erased and narrowed down to a very limited Orthodox tradition. We lose a lot of stories, but that also means, so we have glimmers of other versions of events, but we don't have the full picture. And for me, I've always loved fiction as a way of playing with ideas without having the kind of pride of saying I'm right. So I picked fiction as a way of saying, this is what I feel is correct. And given the massive amount of primary documents and folkloric tradition, it's a very likely option. But I'm also I have the humility to say, I could be wrong. And storytelling has always been a way of playing with ideas. So that's why I chose fiction.
And in the end, when you feel something is right, it's almost like, what's the difference? Because the feeling is real. You're right.
That being said, there's so many primary documents of the extant from the time period from both, the Roman Empire, who were incredibly obsessed with keeping records, and there was tons of texts about Jewish tradition and culture. So we can actually rebuild a very sensual, detailed, precise historical accounting of the time period. It's just like the movements of individuals that are fictional and that we can be positive of. That being said, across Europe, so I oftentimes say that there's always the dominant paradigm that exists in kind of scholastic tradition and in the male elite tradition, and then there's always the folkloric tradition, which is where the stories that are deemed heretical and dangerous, but oftentimes are true, stay alive in relationships. And what you see in Europe is there's a long-standing tradition that the Magdalene is perhaps the equal of Jesus. She's revered as being at least a very important figure. She's associated with sensuality, with the environment, with love. So So I do think that there is a good folkloric tradition. And then when you pair that with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which really show her as being a spiritual teacher in her own right, called the Apostle of the Apostles, when we pair it with those scrolls that were repressed and deemed heretical and dangerous.
Yeah, what is in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I actually think the Gospel of Mary Magdalene's been given too much focus. And I think we have to realize that Gnosticism was actually many different belief systems that have been, unfortunately all glommed together because they were all deemed heresy. But they represented many different beliefs. Mm-hmm. And I would say that the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is interesting because it shows that she was a teacher who taught the apostles, that she was deemed the most intimate of Jesus, and that she was the person who had the best understanding of what he was teaching. That's really interesting. However, I do see a bifurcation between spirit and matter, a kind of rearticulation of Platonism that, for me, is indicative of a certain type of Gnosticism that was very afraid of matter. And for me, that type of Gnosticism seems almost like, when you think of a cultural body as being like a physical body, when you're traumatized, you disassociate your mind from your body. The Gnostics had been persecuted and known, and, they were oftentimes people who had, the Jewish people had known many, many different imperial regimes that have come in and genocidally oppressed them. So, of course, they're in a certain way disassociating that mind from matter. And I think that if you look at the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you see that kind of disassociation, that there is a little bit of a split between the body, the world of the body, and the world of the spirit. And so for me, it's an interesting artifact, but it's not super representative. I'm much more interested in the Gospel of Thomas.
Say more. Why the Gospel of Thomas?
So a lot of Jesus scholars believe that the Gospel of Thomas is probably the earliest collection of Jesus sayings, predating even the Gospels. And that we can actually look at the Gospels as rearticulating a lot of these sayings. They're called apothegms. They're like koans or riddles. And they're very, very tricky and sensual and weird. And they probably give us a better insight into the kind of tricky storyteller that Jesus probably was. And in them, he's always referring to Mary Magdalene as a person who is kind of his, right-hand woman, man. And so I like to think of, and also the Gospel of Philip is another Gnostic text. He kisses Mary Magdalene and calls her his koinonos. And koinonos is such an interesting term because it doesn't even necessarily mean wife. It means spiritual equal. It means like partner.
Could you say perhaps divine union?
Yeah, hierosgamos is definitely a term that's been thrown around. I mean, I think that there's, the thing that feels most exciting about all of this information is there is no one truth. That there's a constellation of details that just show us that the dominant narrative is probably not true. And that feels really generous.
So there's no one truth yet. How would it feel if you had grown up seeing images, not of the isolated Christ on a cross, but, Christ next to Magdalene? And all of these images... So you did in your life because of the way you were raised, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why I think my parents were really interested in Marian tradition and the history of the goddess, and they were very interested, especially in the medieval reverence of the Magdalene and of Mary, the Virgin Mary. So they had a lot of heretical iconography in the house that isn't new, that is old images of Jesus and the Magdalene, Jesus and Mary. Oftentimes, actually, when you see Jesus and his mother, Mary, it's a woman with red hair who's as young as him, and they're often representative as a bridal couple. So, if you were in the medieval era, you would have understood iconographically what was being symbolized there.
That's really interesting. And so why, it happened in Greek culture as well, but why the removal of the goddess? In your research and your retelling, where did it stray? Where did it kind of get corrupted?
Well, I think that there's always the impulse to locate, the original rupture. the original Eden, the original rupture, the original cause of the effect. And it's impossible. I think that with the end of the Bronze Age, where there were many different climatological pressures, there were volcanic eruptions, there were wars and genocide, you see the collapse of a kind of partnership culture, where I actually don't think the term people use is matriarchy, but I don't think that's representative of what it was. It was more that men and women worked in partnership, and the most important character was nature, not any one gender. And I think you see the last holdout of that on Crete in the Mediterranean basin, and something shifts. I mean, there are lots of arguments. One thing that seems clear is that as the alphabet develops and is colonized by the Greeks, there is a conceptual shift. When knowledge is relational and oral, you can't own it. It always involves the environment. It's always adapting to circumstances, to a group of people. That knowledge is kept alive in relationships and in story, that it's never an object. It's never something you can own. But when you start writing stories down, they can ossify and break down, and they can also be seen as objects. And then the things inside the stories, the words themselves that are composed of these abstracted symbols that we made, can suddenly be objects. Suddenly a tree isn't a process, isn't a being that is responsive to you as you name it. It's something that's static on a page that you can own. And so I'm not saying that's the thing that happens, but I do think it's interesting that the rise of alphabetic literacy is paired with the rise of a kind of dominator paradigm, where nature, women, many other beings are seen somehow as being subservient and
children as well.
Children, I mean, yeah, many different beings. And also, like, it's not just men. I think dominator culture is a better term for it, which is just, it's the idea that there's a hierarchy and some people are in charge of other people, rather than it's a community where everybody's involved with their environment in a sustainable long-term festivity.
Yeah, I noticed that you're pulling away from using the word patriarchy, and that you have kind of like, you're beginning to question the use of this word. And so where's that thought leading to?
Words are important. And I think that words can invite people in, and they can also bar people out. And I think that, patriarchy can make it seem simplistically like some men, like men were in charge of women, men are responsible for this, other people are not. And I think that it's important to recontextualize it as everybody. It's an anthropocentric problem. It's a human problem.
Right.
It's a paradigm that happened within human culture, and thus we are all responsible for it. So I think I've been just trying to shift the term so that we can all take responsibility, and rather than claim some kind of victim status, because we're all right now every time we turn on our cars, every time we go to the supermarket, we're culpable. We're complicit in a system that is hurting our kin. So I'm just trying to think, I don't have any answers, but I'm just trying to think about terms that are more precise in locating what's been happening in the past 2,000 years. I do think it's interesting. I think that, Marian tradition a reverence for these feminine figures persists deep into the Middle Ages, that it's not easily eradicated. You have the Cathars, you have the ways in which a kind of land-based cult of saints syncretically fuses with Christianity in Europe. You still have a lot of goddess, I don't know if goddess is the right term, but like feminine nature energy revered and included in Christianity up until the Protestant Reformation, really, and the iconoclasm of that. But interestingly enough, when you kind of begin to destroy the images, you destroy the images, you demonize the cult of saints, you start to see the suppression of these alternative belief systems.
Wow. You say you don't have any answers, but you have stories.
Yeah, I
do. And which are like, filled with all of the gold in a way. And in talking with you, I'm just realizing the importance of oral storytelling, and how simply in the knowingness that we need to slow down, how storytelling can actually be like quite the solution.
I think it's even more than the solution. I think that stories are the most durable mode of knowledge transmission. And like, you know, our oldest scientific data about a geological phenomenon is a 37,000-year-old Aboriginal story that has lived to this date. That boats of breath, as I call them, arcs of narrative, last much longer than offloading knowledge onto a screen or a device that can break.
Right.
And
or that requires an external power source.
Exactly.
Even a book which requires an external power source, right?
Yeah. And I think that it's much safer to offload your most precious information into relationships and into stories that can persist generation to generation. Yeah. You know, part of the reason why myths, I oftentimes say, are boats for your most important environmental information, which is the best way to keep that information moving is in a story that's compelling enough that people want to retell it. So I think right now, as we face perhaps collapse in ways that we can't fully predict or foresee, we can think about using stories as ways of keeping knowledge alive. Can we tell stories that keep the stories of our ancestors alive? I mean, this is practical. It's also like, you know, think 3 generations back of do you know the stories of your great grandfather? Like, no. People disappear so quickly. But in other cultures, in indigenous cultures, ancestral stories will exist for thousands of years. We've gotten really bad at remembering our ancestors. Can we begin to create stories that keep them alive?
Yeah. And, you know, one of my brothers, Kale, he always is reminding us that maybe it's not that 3rd great grandfather, but how about your relationship with your father? Yeah. You know, start there. Because, you know, assuming they're alive, they're the living ancestors and soon to be on the other side. Or, you know, going one step further to your grandparents and keeping those stories alive. Because we all have a role to play in that chain of storytelling.
Yeah, and like you know, these stories, the main way humans used to commune was gathering together to have food and share stories, that the stories stayed alive because you retold them. So can we have family gatherings where we go through and retell the stories? Like, that is important work. That's activism. Like, I've been trying to like problematize our ideas of what like heroic activism looks like. Activism is sharing food with your family and keeping the stories alive consistently.
Yeah. It's so powerful. It's so accessible, and then it's so sad. It makes me sad. You know, like I enjoy these conversations with you, and at the same time, I'm just like, I start to feel adrift in the story of humanity.
Although I think that there is always love and festivity to be had. And I actually think that as we begin to relax into the crisis, we can get our sea legs and start to really dance again. That actually the sad thing is the way we've been living for the past 2,000 years. And just as I said at the beginning, my diagnosis was grim, but it actually compelled me into dynamism and liveliness in a way that I never would have otherwise accessed. We have the potential right now to have so much more fun and so much more love than we did before when we were in this kind of paralyzed, deracinated state. Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And it's kind of a chaos and order cycle that happens. Yeah. And just like you have a sense of urgency to storytell, I have a sense of urgency to bring people together. To bring people together, to heal, to connect, to share. You know, it's available, and now is the time, if nothing else. I wanted to ask you this other question because you have this other word, as words are important, holobiont. Okay, I read this word. What is this word holobiont, and how does it describe what humans actually are?
I love it. So, you know, there was this understanding slowly in the past 20 years that the Earth is an entity. It's a Gaian dynamic homeostasis biosphere, that every different ecosystem and every different being is doing something that keeps the temperature in check, that keeps all of the different elements in check. And the earth is only livable for us and for many other beings because it's constantly using all of its different beings to shift the energy. And that when you change the sunlight and the intensity of certain things, the whole world shifts. And that the world is a being composed of other beings. So holobiont is the idea that every being looks like a self, but is composed of many other beings that are all collaborating to create another being. And holarchy is the idea that beings are created by other beings, that we are all like Matryoshka Russian dolls, we're all built of other dolls. And I think that this is really a sacred piece of information to hold inside of ourselves, which is one, that we are composed of our ancestors, of matter that might have been in a pterodactyl or a hummingbird, of bacteria and fungi, of our intimate relationships that are building us and keeping us and sustaining us. But we're side characters in a bigger body, that we are part of a bigger body, and we're important. And I think that there's another problematic and simplistic take that human beings are bad. The reframe is that we are a key part of this dynamic homeostasis. We are a key part of this holobiont world. And if we can figure out how to best collaborate in the general aliveness, we will feel delicious.
We will feel delicious. You might have some pterodactyl in you, but I think I got lion blood coursing through my veins. As you're saying that, I'm like, ooh, maybe that's why I'm so drawn to all these different things. I got some pieces to think about what actual beings I'm made of, not only in the theoretical or esoteric ways, but in the actual, in the cellular, in the DNA.
We are, I often say the body is an ancestor. Every time we breathe in, we are rebuilding our body metabolically from the actual matter around us. And, I also sometimes think that by virtue of that, we are boats for matter that wants to go on pilgrimage. Like, we may think we want to go to a certain place, to a certain mountain or lake, but there might be matter in me that wants to meet matter there that hasn't seen or touched for thousands of years. Like, we're facilitating this subatomic reunion.
Yes. Wow. This is great. This is a great, retelling of what we are, what we're doing here, what our purpose is, and how it's all connected. Even in the pursuit of human potential and purpose, it tends to be solely human. It tends to be individualistic. And so I love this holobiont. I love this more holistic view of what it means to be human as a part of the whole.
Yeah, we're a key part of the whole. We are important. We're not the most important, but we're also not, throwaway. We're not disposable. We need to find a way. I oftentimes think of the ease with which the bee falls into alignment with the flower, finds the flower, incidentally pollinates other flowers on its way into sweetness. Can we begin to find our sweetness again? Can we begin to fall into our ecological niches? And I think that each of us can do that in a very small way by paying attention to our bodily desires. What smells draw us in? What animals? What places? Where are we drawn to? Yeah.
That's a great way to seek through the senses.
Yeah.
Not just like looking for another teacher or the next meme that's gonna blow your mind.
And I oftentimes think that animals and places are the biggest mentors. That, find your next mentor in a place, in a relationship with, for me, it was a woodchuck, Yeah.
What happened between you and a woodchuck?
It's a long story, but at the start of quarantine, I was looking for guidance, and I oftentimes have animals or birds show up at key moments in my life. And then I start to work with the folklore, the science about them. I start to really use them as a kind of lighthouse. And I was waiting for something sexy, like an eagle or like a mountain lion. And what was really showing up for me were woodchucks. Like, I would go out to my sit spot and a woodchuck would come up. I started to feed them. They were everywhere. Anywhere I went, I would have a woodchuck encounter. It was like a joke. I was seeing a couple of friends who were in my quarantine pod at that point, and they were like, what's with the woodchucks?
Yeah.
And then one day I was driving down the highway and there was a huge hailstorm, like spring hailstorm. And up against the divider line, there was a wet woodchuck that was going to die. It was like no way it could make it back or forth without getting hit by a car. And without thinking, I threw the car into park. I jumped out of the car, I went like this, and the woodchuck jumped into my hands, which is like not normal animal behavior. And I ran it across the road and threw it into the woods. And a lady like pulled her car over and was like, "You're crazy."
Yeah.
But what it made me realize was I thought I was the main character, but I was the side character. Maybe my whole life was about saving that woodchuck. Maybe like that was it. That was the point. And all of these encounters were keying me to be prepared for that moment, to not think, to not double guess myself.
Yeah, that was your purpose in that moment.
I guess so.
And there's so many. And those are the moments that make up a quality lifetime and a lifetime of stories.
Yeah.
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 The love story of Sophie and a woodchuck.
And ever since then, they've been real. And also I found out that there was a figure called Grandma Woodchuck who is important to the Munsee Lenape in the area where I live. I haven't been able to find like many like complete stories, but then I was like, oh, okay, like I guess I'm tapping into something.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, the pieces that are drawn with senses. I mentioned lions. I live in a place. I live in a place called Lions Valley. When I mentioned I'm in Hamul, the specific place is called Lions Valley, and it's in those words, it's in those affirmations and signs. That's how I got here.
And humans have been living alongside lions since our very beginnings. Like they are some of the big cats are some of our oldest companions, spiritually. Physically. I love big cats. For me, my favorite are cheetahs. But I think there's a great book my mom loved about like these women who like sing and walk with lions. I forget the title of it, but yeah, it's an ancient. It's
the women who walk with lions. I think that's a badass title.
Yeah, yeah, and also like lions are all throughout the Bible. Like they're a real scriptural entity. That one of my favorite koans I've been working with for a really long time is Samson and the lion, and he kills this lion, and then he comes back, and all these bees have infested the corpse. And it's always seemed like such a strange experience. I still haven't figured that one out. I think it's one of the most interesting stories in scripture. Yeah,
Judah, the young lion, the conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. Yeah. There's, big cats have so much relevance and like significance to humans.
Yeah.
And it must actually come from the actual relationship.
When you think about evolution as being a relationship, that your adaptations happen in relationship to the other beings you're in an environment with, that, we have shared an evolutionary experience with big cats, and they were our natural predator. And in fact, to this day, they're still one of the only animals that really shows us that we're not totally in control.
One of the only animals who really shows us that we're not totally in control.
Yeah.
On land. That's powerful. I love that. I love that. If I go swimming with some orcas, I'm sure they could show me.
That's a whole other story. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought, though. This is why I love talking to you, Sophie. I told you we were going to get outside of the box. We're in that creative space here. And like, I'm just like, I feel like I'm floating like in a massive world, but it's deep inside like a single cell. That's like the feeling I get when I'm
I love that. And I think that's the kind of psychedelic experience I like, which is like going from the microscopic to the macroscopic. Can we oscillate between the two? So, Adam, it's just such a joy talking to you. It's like mind jazz. Really fun.
Totally. Thank you so much. With that, is there any message, any ask, any final statement you would like to leave for the brothers and the sisters who are listening?
Mostly, thank you for gathering and dancing and healing yourselves. I think that, anytime we do that, it's a kind of important move. And yeah, my book is coming out, and if you're compelled to read it, pre-order it. It helps the authors. So thank you so much, Adam.
Pre-orders are available now. The Madonna Secret and The Flowering Wand. Pick them up. Sophie Strand, so good to see you again. I want to do it again. Let's make it an annual thing.
Yeah, let's do it.
keep cranking out the books. And until then, dance, 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 dance. Everybody to go dance. Everybody go dance. It's the solution to all of our problems.
I think it is. Thank you, Adam.
All right. With that, we're out, family. Peace. Thank you, Sophie.